There's really an eerie similarity to some of the to the latest anti-government unrest that we saw in Nepal, and compare that to say what we saw last year in Bangladesh, where we saw the so-called Monsoon revolution when Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was ousted by anti-government demonstrations, or what we saw 3 years ago in 2022 in Sri Lanka when then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was also ousted by anti-government demonstrations.
Hello and welcome to Times Radio. I'm Arjuna Keshwani-Ham, and today we'll be speaking to Chietigj Bajpaee, a senior research fellow for South Asia, the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. Chietigj, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
Yesterday, Nepal's Prime Minister KP Oli resigned amidst Nepal's worst unrest in decades after 19 protesters were killed and hundreds injured on Monday following a ban on 26 social media sites across Nepal the previous week. This was followed by major unrest on Tuesday. Now it looks like the military has stepped in, but Nepal's political future, of course, remains deeply uncertain. Can you see this? How can you see this panning out over the coming days? There have been rumors about the potential return of a monarchy, which was finally disbanded in 2008 after a pro-democracy revolution in 2006. Do you see the return of a monarch as a possibility in Nepal?
So the immediate reason for the unrest that unseated Prime Minister Oli was the ban on social media platforms, as you noted, that came into effect earlier this month. And it came amid efforts by the government to regulate social media platforms. But I think it speaks to a larger point, which is the level of political dysfunction and economic distress facing Nepal. Nepal has had a revolving door of prime ministers. The most recent one was the 14th prime minister in 16 years. The country's in the midst of an IMF bailout. So, governments have really been seen not to be delivering while facing allegations of corruption, and nepotism, and it follows, as you mentioned, the earlier unrest that we saw this year on the restoration of the monarchy, which was abolished back in 2008. But I think it's important to take a step back when looking at developments in Nepal and frame it in a broader regional context. And there's really an eerie similarity to some of the to the latest anti-government unrest that we saw in Nepal, and compare that to say what we saw last year in Bangladesh, where we saw the so-called Monsoon revolution when Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was ousted by anti-government demonstrations, or what we saw 3 years ago in 2022 in Sri Lanka when then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was also ousted by anti-government demonstrations, or the reoccurring protests that we see in Pakistan, where following the arrest and conviction of former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan in 2023. So I think part of this reflects the level of political dysfunction, economic distress. I think there's also a question about demographic pressures. 36% of the population of South Asia is below the age of 18, which creates a very real risk that the demographic dividend that we often talk about becomes a demographic burden in the absence of sufficient economic opportunities and employment generation. A quarter of Nepal's population, or more than a quarter of Nepal's population, is below the age of 15. It has a median age of about 24 or 25 years, which is why this was referred to as the so-called Gen Z protests. And then, of course, related to this is the influence of social media, which has become an important tool to mobilize the population and offer a means to offer an alternative narrative to the one which is being promoted by governments across the region. So I think there are broader structural challenges that are not only facing Nepal, but countries across South Asia, but which are not, one could argue, unique to what we've seen just play out in Nepal in recent days.
Could we talk a bit about the wider geopolitical picture here? Nepal is obviously wedged between India and China, two major Asian superpowers who don't necessarily have the friendliest of relationships. Can you give us a picture of how these two players compete in Nepal and who might step into the unfolding chaos here?
Well, again, similar to the points I made about demographics, economic distress, and dysfunctional democracies, the same can be said about geopolitics. Nepal, like various countries in South Asia, is often caught in the crossfire of tensions in the China-India relationship. We saw Prime Minister Oli visiting. He was in China just last week to attend the military parade that Beijing held. He was one of three South Asian leaders that did attend the parade. So Nepal has tried to cultivate a close relationship with China. On occasion, this is also extended to clamping down on Tibetan exile communities which are living within Nepal. At the same time, obviously, Nepal maintains a long-standing relationship with India and an almost open border with the country. So I think it is a source of friction. China has become more risk averse in its outbound investment in recent years. Particularly as it doesn't necessarily see that it's getting the return on investment that it's on some of its infrastructure projects. So that is, I think, an additional source of friction. And also, Nepal is included among these countries when we talk about the so-called debt trap diplomacy narrative. That a lot of these countries are seen to be the level of economic distress that they face has been fueled by their dependence on loans that are being provided by China, and that China's opaque lending practices or predatory economic activities are inflicting economic distress on the countries in the region, including Nepal.
Now, going back to the SCO summit, Modi obviously travelled to China for the first time in 7 years. There's been a lot of talk about potential China-India normalization going back to a sort of pre-2020 Galvan state. Do you see a genuine improvement of ties going forward, or have signs of improvement largely been chimeral?
Well, I would frame Prime Minister Modi's visit to China as more of a tactical rather than a strategic reset to the relationship. And what I mean by that is the optics have clearly been positive. We've heard rhetoric about the dragon and the elephant dancing together, about both countries being development partners and not rivals. But the reality is that none of the fundamental grievances in the bilateral relationship have yet been resolved. And this includes, of course, their border issue, but also other sources of friction. Beijing's so called all weather relationship with Pakistan, particularly in the aftermath of recent India Pakistan hostilities, water disputes. China is constructing the world's largest hydroelectric power project across a river that traverses both countries, the Brahmaputra River. And then the Tibet question. The Dalai Lama has recently turned 90 and he's become more vocal on the issue of succession. So there's a very real risk that his successor could be reincarnated among the Tibetan community in exile in India, which could add to frictions in the China India relationship. So there are several emerging, or we could call it re-emerging, fault lines in the China-India relationship. For the time being, both sides have chosen to shelve these issues in order to deepen and revive relations. But I think it's not a question of if, but when we see a resumption of tensions between China and India. Perhaps the only point that I would make more broadly about China's military modernization or defense um, platforms is what we see in Pakistan. Given this sort of ironclad or all-weather relationship with China has with Pakistan, we've seen that Pakistan is increasingly emerging as a testing ground for Chinese weaponry. So during the most recent hostilities, we saw the Pakistani military using Chinese-made J-10 fighter aircraft or PL-15 air-to-air missiles in combat operations against India. There were also allegations or reports that it shot down several U.S. Or Indian fighter aircraft, including French and Russian-made aircraft. So I think, that is an important watch point. That the degree to which Pakistan is emerging as this testing ground for Chinese
You've
weaponry.
also written, I believe, about the RIC, the RIC, in the past. Do you envisage a possible comeback of a strong Russia, India, China trilateral relationship?
Yeah, I mean, we saw several photo opportunities of the three leaders of China, Russia, and India meeting during the SCO summit, but we haven't seen a formal revival of the RIC, the Russia, India, China trilateral framework. There's been no announcement on a timetable for the next meeting. In some ways, I think it reflects the fact that the RIC has, to some degree, been subsumed or superseded by other initiatives that focus on South-South cooperation. So whether it be the BRICS, whether it be the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I mean, it's important to remember that the RIC emerged in the late 1990s. It was a Russian-led initiative to essentially challenge the U.S.-led global order. I think it lost some of its momentum in 2020 during the COVID pandemic and following the border clashes between India and China. But Moscow has been trying to revive it, and Beijing has expressed interest, and I think New Delhi has been somewhat lukewarm about it. And that reflects, I think, the fact that India is to some degree the odd man out among the three countries. It's consistently tried to convey an image of itself as non-Western, but not explicitly anti-Western. And we saw this, for instance, with Modi's trip to China. He attended the SCO summit in Tianjin, but he didn't attend the military parade in Beijing. So it reflects this attempt by New Delhi to maintain at least a semblance of a balanced foreign policy. It wants to move closer to China and Russia, but it doesn't want to distance itself from the US in the West, in line with its longstanding commitment to strategic autonomy. So I think the revival of the RIC still remains very much a work in
Yeah.
Mongolia, say China or Russia obviously doesn't share